religious shame and guilt does not make people more moral. It is demonstrably the greatest factor in people acting out in morally repugnant ways that they themselves are appalled.
My question relates to something I've heard you speak about in the past with regards to the 12 steps of recovery. And my question is, you've mentioned that as a person reaches their fourth step, or if a person does a thorough and honest fourth step inventory, and sorry to any of the listeners who are not familiar with the work, I appreciate you bearing with me in my question. But if a person does a thorough and honest fourth step, it will likely bring them closer to the religion of their father. And my question is, as someone who was raised in a traditionally Orthodox and from household, I've definitely deviated a little bit, or maybe a lot of it, from the traditions that I was raised with. And a result of that is being filled with a lot of shame and guilt. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if, or rather, what you would suggest as a method of coping with that shame and guilt between steps 1 and 4, mm-hmm. So that when I reach step 4 and do that thorough and honest inventory, and God willing, develop a closer relationship with the religion of my father, mm-hmm. what would you suggest in the interim?
Okay. So as you said, there's a lot of inside baseball over here. There are terms that not everyone's going to be familiar with, but I think that's fine because a lot of this stuff is self-explanatory, and I will try to fill in a little bit of it for those who are unfamiliar. There are two things here that I'm hearing from you. I love this question. I love it because it's relevant, meaning you're actually asking for yourself. It's not just theoretical. And it's also, it's a very common question. It's very common. I'm sure you know that it's common, but there are many other people who have the same question. So I know that this will benefit many people who are listening. First of all, I want to clarify. You mentioned that I said, or you've heard me say, that after your fourth step, there should be some, maybe call it normalization of religious observance. Okay. I want to just clarify. Now, maybe you meant this and you just didn't say it as explicitly as I would have liked you to have said it, or maybe you didn't even catch it when I said it because I didn't say it as explicitly as I would have liked to have said it. And that is the following. What have I said? And I do stand by this, and I admit that I've said this many, many times, and I still stand by saying it. Someone who is raised religious, let's back up a second. The 12-step model, it is essential and inherent to the 12-step model that one needs a relationship with a higher power. Because the 12 steps are non-sectarian, they do not dictate who that higher power is or what theology one is to believe in. They stay out of your religion. They just tell you that you need to have a higher power. Okay. But when someone was raised with a belief in God, when someone was raised religious, very often when they come into the rooms of recovery, they come in already with a lot of baggage surrounding the idea of God. To the extent that I think, just my humble little opinion here, someone who comes from an atheistic background will find it much easier to find a higher power than someone who comes from a traumatic religious upbringing. The person who comes from an atheistic background, you might think that constitutes a pretty formidable challenge, but it's not, because by the time someone comes into the rooms of recovery, they're pretty humble. They're ready to entertain some new ideas, and I haven't found that it is a real insurmountable obstacle. However, in contrast, somebody who comes from a religious background that is fraught with a lot of trauma it can be quite difficult to find that relationship with their higher power. And that is why I often say, and still stand by saying, that if you come from a religious background and you are finding it difficult to forget about return to that religion, but even entertain any notion of a higher power because of the associations that the whole God concept has for you, then it is absolutely essential that when you do your fourth step, which is an inventory, but a large part of the inventory is the resentments list, that you make sure that you include God and religion and religious leaders and everything else that has any negative association for you. You put that in your resentment list and you work through it just like every other resentment that you are going to work through in that inventory. So just to clarify, I'm not sure if that's what you meant or if it wasn't as clear as it could have been, but what I said about the power of the fourth step, particularly with people who are coming from a background of religious trauma, is please, by all means, include all of the religious trauma, whether it's God himself or the Torah or Moshe Rabbeinu or anything. If you have a resentment, if you feel a resentment, do not be so pious and holy to be afraid to put it on your resentment list, because I promise you, you're not doing any favors to yourself or to the God of Israel by shying away from putting it on your resentment list. I promise you, if you put it on your resentment list, I mean, if it's genuine, don't put it on your resentment list just to be a tough guy, but, to try to be edgy. But if you really have a resentment, put it on your resentment list, work through it in the way that the fourth step works with the columns. And I'm not going to get into that here because that's really inside baseball, but by all means, work through it. And by the time you finish working through that resentment, you will find that a large degree of the resistance, the internal resistance, which was really self-protection, it was you protecting yourself from toxicity and from abuse, a lot of that will have been removed, and you will have the freedom to re-engage with God in a way that is safe. So I just want to clarify, did you understand that was the context within which I had mentioned the fourth step?
Not entirely, but now that you've reminded me, I'm reminded. Thank you.
Okay, great. Since you mentioned the fourth step, just do the fourth step and you're going to have this massive shift, which I'm saying is not exactly true. What I was saying is if you have religious trauma, please, please, please include that in your resentments. But since you mentioned a step that has this sort of epiphany tied into it, then I would say the ninth step is like that for many, many people. It's not a coincidence that that's where in the big book it talks about the promises. The ninth step promises. We'll be amazed before, if we're painstaking about this phase of our development, we'll be amazed before we're halfway through, right? So that, when the ninth step is the amends, when you actually, and it's terrifying. The amends are terrifying. When you actually go and you confront people and you try to start repairing relationships, that can have an amazingly healing effect where all of a sudden all the obstacles are just removed and the light just starts shining in. So if there's a step that has that kind of massive shift associated with it, I would say it's 9. But regarding step 4, if you have religious trauma, use the fourth step to work through it. The fourth step is your tool for working through it. Okay. Now, the other point that you raised was, how do you deal with religious shame and guilt while you're still not as observant as it sounds like you yourself may even wish you were? Okay, so let's talk about that. So first of all, how do we know that there's a problem with religious shame and guilt? Maybe it's not problematic. Maybe it's good. Maybe it'll help you. I'm asking this in earnest. Why am I asking it in earnest? Because there are many people, if not a majority of people, who actually believe, well, I shouldn't say majority of people, a majority of religious people who actually believe that religious shame and religious guilt will actually make people more moral. Okay, so I really have no time or patience or energy for proving my point, so I'm going to make my point in a very sloppy, lazy way, in which case you have you're never bound, you're never bound by any agreement to believe anything I say, but especially here, I'm not going to prove this to anybody, so if you want to just completely reject it, by all means, completely reject it. But I'm just going to tell you what I believe, and that is religious shame and guilt does not make people more moral. It is demonstrably the greatest factor in people acting out in morally repugnant ways that they themselves are appalled with. And it initiates a guilt cycle, which actually, you see the Tanya map behind me. So in chapter 26 of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe actually describes this pretty vividly. He says, sometimes the Yetzer Hara comes to you in a cloak of piety and it asks you to feel guilt about your moral failings, but it's only doing so to make you feel pain, emotional pain, which then you'll try to numb through indulgence, and then you'll have something to really feel guilty about, and then, of course, you'll try to numb the emotional pain with even greater indulgence and even lower forms of acting out, because of course you're in greater pain and you have an even lower opinion of yourself, and it becomes this vicious cycle. So chapter 26 of Tanya says pretty clearly how dangerous guilt, religious guilt, can be. And what is his solution? By the way, in chapter 26 of Tanya, he says set a time, set an appointment, which you could call that your 10th step inventory. After you do your 4th step, people have different opinions whether you do that once in a lifetime or not, but certainly a 10th step is a spot check inventory, and to do it on a daily basis, especially at your bedtime Shema, is a good time to do it. So yeah, chapter 26 of Tanya says, make an inventory, daily inventory, have an appointment, have a certain time and a place that is marked off for cleaning up your deficiencies. But the rest of your day, don't think about it, because it's not pious, it's not cute, it's not productive, you're not helping anyone. This is not what God wants. This is just, you can call it your disease, you can call it the Yetzer Hara, but it's a negative force coming to you in a cloak of piety, trying to undermine your recovery / teshuvah process. So my advice to you would be, don't touch it. Don't look at it. Ignore it like you would a voice that tells you that the solution right now is to pick up. Just like a voice would come to you right now and say, I know it'll make you feel better. Pick up your drug of choice. And now, hopefully, at this point of sobriety, you'd be able to say, oh, that voice is not helpful. It's not going to do it. Listening to that voice is not going to do anything I'm going to be happy I listened to. And the same thing with religious guilt. Completely ignore it. It's not coming from a healthy place. It's not. Keep doing your step work. Speed up, by the way. In Akron, they used to pound out the steps in a day. Okay, so really find a sponsor who will do the step work with you quickly. Get through that 4th step. And you know what? I sense in your voice and in your words that you're yearning to return to Yiddishkeit. And you will. And you'll see how your recovery and your teshuvah process not only dovetail, but ultimately you'll see how it's one thing. Does that help you, what I just said?
Yes, tremendously. Thank you.
Okay, amazing. Thank you for your vulnerability. You can keep the duck. By the way, you heard that joke.
Thank you.
So I would just want to make a commentary. So in a 12-step meeting, everybody shares, and there's nobody who ends up being the sucker. And sometimes in our religious life, we don't find that level of honesty and vulnerability, and we lament that. So what I would like to encourage you to do is bring the honesty and the vulnerability of the rooms to your faith community. You're going to say, but I'm not such a strong member of my faith community. I know, not yet, but you will be. You will be in time. And one of the things you can do is bring the lessons of recovery to your faith community. And remember that the original version of the 12th step actually said to carry this message to others, not to other alcoholics. Bill W. originally wanted to bring the message of the spiritual awakening to everybody, not just to alcoholics. But then they told him, manage your expectations. Let's focus, just pick a niche and bring the message to alcoholics. But originally the 12th step was to bring to bring the message of recovery, which is really just the message of spiritual awakening to everybody. So you should have a lot of success in that. Okay. Thank you very much.
Rabbi.
Yeah, my pleasure. We'd like to extend special thanks to Mendel Simon and 9x9 Tech for powering this call-in show and making it possible for us to connect with our amazing audience. 9x9 Tech offers a one-stop service for all your communication needs, along with personalized tech solutions catered specifically towards your business. Visit 9x9tech.com today. That's 9x9tech. I'm going to spell the tech. TECH.com. Thank you, Mendel and the team, for your incredible support. Hey, this is Shais Taub. You were just watching a clip from this class. If you want to get the full context, the full class that this clip that you just watched was from, you watch right here. Click right here.